Hi, everybody, and welcome to Unified, a podcast feed from First Church Belmont Unitarian Universalist. We'll be sharing sermons and stories, especially thematic content made new every week. We're so glad you're here, and for more information about who we are and opportunities to grow and deepen, swing by the church on Sundays or check out our website at uubelmont.org. And for now, enjoy this new content. Two whole stories, one from me now and one from Martha later. And the one from me comes from actually one of the cultures that's part of me. So it's about an eighth of me, technically, is Irish. And this is a traditional Irish tale about death. And it's one of my favorites. And it starts with a little boy who's traveling to see his grandmother. And he's very excited because his grandmother's one of his favorite people in the entire world. And he knows that she's sick, and he doesn't know how sick, he doesn't know how close to dying she is. He just knows this is probably one of the last few times he's going to get to see her. And he takes a train, and he loves getting off of the train and smelling the ocean air for the first time. Partially, he knows that means he's about to see his grandma. And so then he goes from the train station down to the beach, and he walks along the beach to her house. And along the way, he sees off in the distance this large black figure sort of floating. And he gets closer, and it actually gets more confusing the closer he gets, because he notices that it's even larger than he thought, and actually really is not touching the sand. And he gets even closer, and he can see that it's death. And so he decides to give Death, of course, a really wide berth when he's walking around him to try and get to his grandmother's house. But Death sees him off in the distance and calls out and says, "Excuse me, do you know which house is Ms. O'Callaghan?" And of course, that's his grandmother's house. And so thinking quick on his feet, he says, "It's the one way at the end of the beach," which is not true. He was lying to Death. And so Death floats past his grandmother's house, and he thinks quick on his feet still again. And he says, "I don't want my grandmother to die today." So he looks around on the beach, and he sees this huge shell. So he grabs the huge shell, and he runs up behind Death, and he jumps up into the air, and he squeezes the shell down on top of Death. And he squeezes it down and squeezes it down and squeezes Death all the way inside of this shell, flips it over, grabs some seaweed, jams it in. So Death is trapped inside of the shell. Feels pretty good about himself, throws the shell into the ocean, doesn't think about it again, goes up to his grandmother's house. And there's this second smell that he loves of his grandmother starting to make his favorite soup, this chicken soup that she started, the broth. And it fills the house with this incredible smell, and he's so happy. And she says she needs him to go get 2 more ingredients for the soup. And he gives her this huge hug, so happy to see her again. And he takes off to town to get the chicken and some carrots. And as soon as he gets into town, he sees there's a bit of a fracas outside of the butcher shop and a bit of confusion. And he kind of makes his way through the crowd, and he says he needs 1 chicken. And the butcher says, "I'll do my best." And the butcher grabs the chicken, puts him down on the chopping block, wriggling around, fresh, takes the cleaver, chunk, and the little chicken head flies off and then sucks right back onto the chicken body. And the chicken's like, "Ah, ah, 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 ah." And the butcher says, "It's been happening all day. I'm going to try one more time." And he takes the cleaver, shunk, and the little chicken head flies off and then sucks right back on. And the little boy's like, "Oh, wait." And so he says, "Maybe just vegetable soup." And so he runs out of the butcher shop down the, least he'll get the carrots. And he goes up to the farm stand and he asks the farmer, he says, "Okay, I need like 3 really big carrots." And the farmer says, "I'll do my best. You just watch." And he goes off to the side from the farmer stand and tries and pulls up some carrots, gets one really big one, pulls it up out of the ground, and seems harder than it should be. And he gets all the way back to the farm stand. He says, "I'll try and sell you this one." And the second he lets go, the carrot kind of dances back over to the ground and nestles right back down. And the little boy knows what he has to do. And he goes all the way back to his grandmother's house. And he tells her what he did. And she sort of smiles. And she brings him in close. And she touches her hand to the side of his face, really gently. And she says, "My sweet, sweet boy, I loved you your entire life. And I love you way past the time that I'm gone. But this is the time where my life ends." And he hugged her, and he cried. Partially because he knew he was going to have to swim into the freezing cold ocean. And he did. He found the shell, and he brought it back up onto the shore. He popped out the seaweed, and death unfurled up out of the shell and was like, "Oh, that was fantastic. I haven't had a break in hundreds of years. Thank you so much, little boy." Rediscovering work-life balance. Death took a sabbatical, and he said, "I'll be back in 1 month's time." And the little boy ran up, told his grandmother what had happened. They made soup with whatever they had around, and they had this magical last month together. And then sure enough, she did end up dying. And from that moment on, she lived on in his memory. And every time he walked out of that train and smelled the sea breeze for the first time, every time he made his chicken soup with his children and then his grandchildren, he thought of her, just as today we think of all these and so many more. Amen.
I also have a story to share with you. This is an old story from our friends and neighbors in the Buddhist tradition. The original version of this story appears in the Buddhist legends, translated in the Pali text of the Dhammapada commentary. What I will tell you is an interpretation of this story. An interpretation means who I am, and what is meaningful to my community is the lens through which I read this story. Once upon a time, there lived a young woman named Kisa Gotami. She was a very happy woman with a wide circle of loved ones. But one day something very sad happened, and someone she loved very much got sick and died. Now, Kisa Gotami had never met death before. She was so lost in her sadness and her grief that she felt like that grief might eat her all the way up. It was simply too heavy for her to carry. So she decided she would not accept that her loved one had died. She would simply bring him back to life. So she went house by house to all her neighbors, and she said, "Can you give me a cure? Something that will bring my loved one back to life?" And each one of her neighbors said, "The only person with the power to do that is the Buddha." And so Kisa Gotami climbed the long, winding road to the mountain where the Buddha lived, and her grief was very, very heavy the whole way. She said to the Buddha, the great teacher, "My neighbors told me that you are the only person with the power to bring my loved one back to life." And the Buddha said, "Okay, my daughter, let's see what we can do." "I will get you anything you need," said Kisa Gotami. "All I need," said the Buddha, "is 1 pinch of white mustard seed." "Great," Kisa Gotami said. "Every home has white mustard seed. Anything special about this white mustard seed?" And the Buddha said, "You must bring it to me from the home where no one has ever died." This will be so easy, thought Kisa Gotami. So she went to her first neighbor's house. And she said, "Do you have white mustard seed?" And they said, "Of course. One moment, we'll get it for you." She said, "Okay, but wait, has anyone ever died here? Have you ever experienced grief?" And yes, the neighbor said softly, "My father died just last summer." And the neighbor invited Kisa Gotami in, and made her a cup of tea, and told her some stories about her father. And Kisa Gotami told her some stories about her loved one, too. Then she went to her next neighbor, and again, the neighbor gave her some mustard seed, but when Kisa Gotami remembered to ask if anyone had died there, if they had experienced grief, the neighbor told him about her grandmother who had passed away. Another neighbor talked about his cousin who had died, another about a beloved dog in their family. A neighbor child even told her about a fish that he had loved so much who had died. At each home, she was invited in and given a cup of tea. And after a while, talking and sharing pictures and objects and memories of her loved one, she began to see that those dead were still in and among with us. And her grief felt lighter and lighter as she walked from house to house. Finally, at long last, she walked up the mountain, again, her grief a little bit lighter this time. "Have you brought me the mustard seed from the home where no one has died?" the Buddha asked. "No," Kisa Gotami said, "but I have learned that when I share my grief and the memories of my beloved with my neighbors, it doesn't feel so heavy to carry after all." And the Buddha smiled. During this time of the year, many traditions say that the veil between the world of the dead and the world of the living is at its thinnest. We are able to remember and honor our beloved dead with a little more clarity. As the leaves are changing and falling, we remember that death is a part of all that is life. There are few among us who have never experienced grief, and there are none among us who never will experience any loss. My own grandmother, who is beloved to me, is nearing the end of her life in this realm and her time to cross over into whatever comes next. So this past week, I had the opportunity to go and visit her to say goodbye. In preparation, I called a couple of my friends and my neighbors, and I said, "Have you experienced a grief like this and a loss? What did you do? How did you get through it?" And they all gave me some good advice about griefs of their own. They gave me some suggestions. They said, "Look at photos together." So I brought some photos to my grandmother, and we went through them. She told me stories about the people in the pictures. Many of those stories could have been true. And I spent some time with my grandfather, too. My grandfather, whose grief at the loss of his spouse of 64 years is wide and deep and exquisite. I didn't know what I could possibly say that could comfort him, or if there was anything that I could do. The first night that I was there, after my grandmother had fallen asleep at 7 o'clock, I asked my grandfather if he wanted to go down to the living room and hang out with me. And he said, "Oh, well, usually I hang out with her, and I read my book." And I said, "Okay, I can do that." And so I got my book, and he sat in the rocking chair next to the hospital bed, and I sat on the floor next to the hospital bed, and we read our books together in companionable silence. Sometimes there is nothing to say. And sometimes there is nothing to do. But we can do the one thing that we can always do, which is accompany one another. Ram Dass says at the end of the day, we are only ever just walking one another home. So come and bring your grief here. Let it be companioned here. It is not too big and it is not too scary for it to be known and loved here in the presence of community. Come and bring your heart to this altar. You are not alone. We will travel alongside you, or maybe we will sit and read our books together in companionable silence. Maybe sometimes that is just enough. When my grief for the world feels too heavy, I sit with my neighbor and we share a cup of tea. She tells me her stories and I tell her mine, and I'm able to walk back up the mountain a little bit lighter. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.